But I wanted to ask you, like, because when I read the book, one thing I kept asking myself is, how do you know? And you might answer that by saying, well, there's a virtuous tangle. I mean, in the book, there's this idea that a tangle can be virtuous. There can be, it can be a being entangled is. So the way I saw it, and you can sort of correct me if I'm wrong, is that the tangle of science refers to there being all sorts of different aspects and features and things that are happening in science that are sort of related in like to provide what you might call a coherent whole in a way. Maybe lots of different, some are propositions, some are equations, some are methods or concepts. And these things can all be interrelated in sort of quite an intimate way. And then if you have a really rich tangle, and this is sort of defined in the book, what a really sort of virtuous or rich tangle would be, then the more virtuous the tangle is, the more reliable the what you have is for maybe for certain purposes. I mean, is that more or less the idea?
Yeah, so maybe it helps think through some examples of this. So one of the examples I like to talk about is building or putting someone on the moon, right? Building a space shuttle. And so that's clearly a product of science, right? Like, and we should trust it, right? Like, or we hypothetically should trust, this rocket that like NASA has built that is going to put someone on the moon. And the question of why you should trust it, right? It's not just because of like the abstract, but the theories and the hypotheses went into this. It's because of a wide range of pieces that need to go into making this, like making mean that I want to get on this particular space shuttle, right? So yeah, if it's got to be built using things like Einstein's theory of relativity, it's going to understand the way that like gravitational shifts are going to happen, all these sorts of bits and pieces. But I also have to like trust that the material science is in place, right? That someone has done the right experiments to check that it's like aerodynamic, that it holds up under heat. That the people doing the laser welding, or sorry, just the welding for this thing, right, are using the right kinds of welding techniques such that we know that it will connect or that it will withhold the heat and stress of space launch. Right. And why can I trust those welding techniques? Well, because there's a whole other system of things that are material science and practices and, understandings and skills that these people have as they're building these things. And so you have this sort of network that seems to connect in the right kinds of ways. Why can I trust this type of welding? Well, it was used on other things that do similar stuff, right? It was used for satellites that I know get launched. Well, so now I've got this connection between something over here that seemingly like is useful for job X. I want to use it for job Y. Job X and job Y are similar, so I can connect the two of them up. When I say I can rely on this type of welding for my like spaceship, and for basically everything else that goes in the spaceship, I have similar reasons, right? Why am I using this particular thing? Because this network of other pieces that I can pull and say I can justify it in using it here. And in the same way, and it starts like I think to get into some of the stuff we're talking about, like when it comes to science and pseudoscience, right? If someone told me they built me a spaceship using pure theory, right, they never experimented, they never tested anything, there was no like actual real world contact, or someone said I've built it using Newtonian mechanics, right, and only Newtonian mechanics, I haven't thought about any stuff that comes with like general relativity or the stuff that the way it talks about gravity, I shouldn't get in that spaceship, right? Like you should just not, because like they've clearly not got the right network of evidence behind them to justify why this thing will launch. And it may well launch, but I still shouldn't trust that it's going to launch. Right. And so one of the nice things about reliability is this question of reliable for what, right? It comes with context built in, right? Why should I get in the spaceships that built with all these other bits and pieces of Tangle? Well, because I've thought about the way these pieces are reliable, in which context they're reliable. For the Newtonian mechanics spaceship, the context is just wrong, right? Like, which isn't to say that Newtonian mechanics isn't great and reliable and useful in other ways, but whoever has built this thing using pure theory and Newtonian mechanics is clearly not actually understood the context in which those theories are applicable, right? They're doing bad science in some way, shape, or form, and I should not trust the outputs.
Sure, yeah. Let me pick up on one thing there. So, I mean, I know this webinar is called The Tangle of Pseudoscience, but I mean, is it fair to say that when we think about pseudoscience, often what makes it pseudoscience is that it's not supported by a rich sort of tangle. It's sort of it stands on its own apart from all of this other mass of science that is sort of, being sort of building on each other for, you know, many, many iterations maybe, and it's sort of intimately entangled, if you like. But then pseudoscience is often sort of set apart from that. And this is sort of an idea I had. I mean, that what you would say about pseudoscience sometimes is that what makes it pseudoscience is the lack of a virtuous tangle. I mean, is that fair?
Yeah, I think that's right. Again, I think it's a spectrum. So like, you know, some things that look virtuous in some contexts are not going to be virtuous in others. And that's going to like tell you the difference between, like, again, so much is a context dependent, right? Genomic mechanics is super virtuous and a great science in some contexts and not great in other contexts. But when we think about sort of the tangles underpinning these things, so we sort of draw out three features of a tangle in the book that we think make for a virtuous tangle. So it's entangled, right? So it's got lots of connections happening all over the place. It's rich. It's got lots of different types of pieces supporting it, right? So again, my pure theory rocket ship has only got theory supporting it, and that's kind of suspect. You should be suspicious of that, right? In the same way that like one that has lots of different pieces happening, right? You're more likely to think it's got something good going on. All these pieces are connecting not just to each other, but to the final product, and there are lots of diversity happening. And then the final thing is long-tailed, right? So I should be able to see how this thing connects out to other pieces of science where it's been successful, right? And the better it is connected to these other things, like further out, the more likely it is to be working in this context. And so when we think about like pseudoscience, it's probably going to be lacking along one of those three dimensions, not necessarily all of them. But when you look at things like, and I like to, like, the classic examples of astrology, right? Everyone brings up astrology as their like example of pseudoscience. You know, Popper and Kuhn and Lakatos and those pieces. But like, one of the things I think interesting about astrology is that it does connect to science in some way, shape, or form, right? It's pulling on astronomy. It's looking at the orbits of planets and stars and all these other bits and pieces. Like this one piece of it that's like actually really solid. But then it's got these other bits and pieces on top of it that are all sort of connected in really weird ways that look very different than what's happening in science. So astronomy has got these connections where it's like we're looking at experimental data, we're like making predictions, we're looking at the way that telescopes work, we're pulling from great general relativity, right? There's these connections that all work together. In astrology, it's very sparse, right? There's not a lot of evidence happening beyond what it's pulling out from astronomy, right? So there's not that much by way of data points that are happening in astronomy. Where it is looking at things, it's very like, and then pointing at this one thing that like, and because he's a Leo, he like obviously is in a leadership position, and like it does that a bunch of times, but doesn't really connect up why these people are all sort of functioning the same way. So it's sparse. It's not very rich. It's not pulling on lots of different types of evidence. You know, it's very much like the same pieces of facts repeated over and over again in different contexts. And it's not very long-tailed. It's sort of like almost circles back in on itself, right? It self-justifies in ways. I think that's one of the things that we can sort of start to identify when it comes to pseudoscience. So a lot of pseudosciences, and this is getting back to the stuff that like Popper was thinking about, you know, like these theories that are so flexible, they don't have enough pieces in them to hold them constrained, such that like they just sort of warp however you want them to. Anytime you got a new piece of evidence, you just take your structure and you just like shift it slightly, and you can accommodate anything you want with these structures because it's so sparse. It's just nothing there to stop you from doing whatever you want with them in a lot of ways.
Is that then a connection to the old Popperian idea that, you know, what's characteristic of pseudoscience is that it can accommodate anything that comes along. It's unfalsifiable. I mean, is there still room for this idea of unfalsifiability as a, you know, a core feature of pseudoscience, or is, I mean, do you really see this as replacing the old Popperian idea?
I think it certainly accommodates and connects with other stuff that's happening with Popper. Like I think Popper was onto something when it comes to the falsifiability thing, right? He's talking about Marxism and Freudian theories, and like I think he's right that like part of the problem with them is they're so flexible. So when we think about good science, often there's so much evidence being brought in, you can't really warp it in new ways, because if you do, you're like coming up against these other pieces of evidence. Like, no, that's not what's happening here. It can't be because I've got this other piece of evidence. And so the theory that works here, and if it works here, you can't move it this way in this other way. So these other pieces like constrain the structures in some way that mean that you sort of can't do the same warping you can do with like Marxism or Freudian psychoanalysis, right? These things are so shiftable, I think, because there's not enough content to them somehow. So then we can sort of start to accommodate the way that Kuhn is thinking, Popper is thinking about these things, using this tangle structure. and start to understand what actually is he was getting at. I think he was in many ways implicitly using this kind of network structure underneath it, and we can start to articulate that.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, the other thing it reminds me of is just coherence theory. So, sort of this old idea in epistemology that, coherentism, the more sort of your network coheres, the more, well, you can put in what you like, the more likely it is to be true, you might say, or the more likely it is to latch onto reality. It seems a little bit like that, but maybe just a more sophisticated version, or or a version which is more specifically about science, whereas coherentism is not, doesn't have to be just about science. I mean, do you think that's fair
Yeah, I think
comparison?
that's right about that. I mean, like coherence theory, I think gets something right about the fact that like the more you, again, the more you're constrained, the better off you are in some ways of trusting what you're doing, which is not to say that anything that's like super constrained is necessarily always going to be really good. But just because you've got these like coherent networks, like something about that, if everything's clicking in the right way, it seems like you're more justified in believing that it's getting at something, again, to get back to truth, like it's getting something real about the world, because like you're suddenly not getting this conflicting pieces of information. And like, yeah, I mean, like conflict is another interesting one of these kinds of things. Like, what do you do when pieces of your tangle are conflicting with each other, or like other bits and pieces? And like, again, we can start to see ways that like you can bring in extra evidence to start figuring out like, well, what is it about my network that's gone wrong if I've got conflicting internal pieces?
Yeah. I remember reading a bit of the book about this idea of conflict, and it reminded me of my old work on inconsistent science, and this theory by Matthias Frisch in his book on classical electrodynamics, where he argues that the best version of classical electrodynamics is an inconsistent theory, and it's the best version because it's the most useful. I mean, you can do the most with it. Like, it has all the bits that you need. It's basically the textbook theory that kids learn at college, university, and they're given all of the best tools. But strictly speaking, if you manipulate them in the right way, you can derive a contradiction. And this maybe could be useful for the Tangle idea, because you could say, look, actually, there's an inconsistency here, but it doesn't mean it's a bad tangle. It's actually really reliable, and that's why we teach classical electrodynamics to university kids in that way, because it's that bunch of equations are a highly reliable bunch for solving problems.
Yeah, I wonder if this is where a lot of stuff that context comes into, right? So like, for this context, for this job, it's super reliable. It means we can sort of deprioritize some of the conflicting, right? Like back to the lab, we can all recognize there's some problems happening, but like right here, right now, those conflicts aren't like directly butting up against each other here for this like particular job in the way that like it might if you, I don't know, pick your favorite terribly conflicting piece we have to yell about things like gravitational wave energy or something. We're like there's just two theories and we just don't know which one's right, and like they can't both be true, and they both have to be like, one of them's got to be the thing that's happening here right now, and like now we've got to care about the fact there's a conflicting pieces that both seem super like relevant. But like the fact that we can sort of abstract away from it means that like we can sort of always isolate bits of the tangle that like, or like prioritize certain chunks of it to think about why we can think this is right, or like not right, but like reliable for this work.
Yeah, I think that has to be right. I think often when you have these inconsistent sets of propositions in science that someone can sort of carefully pick out and then sort of manipulate them in just the right way so that you can derive a contradiction. One thing you want to say is, you've had to work really hard to do that. And the vast majority of things you can do with this set of propositions will give you useful, good stuff. It's just that if you do exactly what you just did in the way you did it, yes, you can derive a contradiction. So yeah, it's about how you're using what you have in front of you.
Yeah, and I mean, I think the sides of contradiction are actually quite interesting for science, right? So like things like general relativity and quantum mechanics like conflict, right? Like they're just clearly not going to be both compatible with each other. We're gonna have to modify probably both of them or at least one of them. But when they conflict, like black holes, like the most extreme spaces in physics,
Sure.
and both of them are really, really hyper, like they're some of the most reliable theories we've ever come up with in every other context that we put them into, right? It's just they're these like hyperspace where you're like, okay, something's not working here. And like, that's exciting, right? Like these points where you're like, okay, now we've got to resolve this like conflict in our tangle. Or like, and I think a lot of science works this way. Like really what we're trying to get up the tangle is like, you know, this is kind of how science works, right? You find these conflicts, figure out how to resolve them. Or you're like, there's a huge gap over here. We're like, I think I can rely on this thing, but like, God, I have no idea what's happening here, or like whether I can actually make this move. And so now we have to do a bunch of work to fill in this space with like methodologies or theories or experiments or whatever. So you're just constantly building these things up to try and figure out why this thing is the thing I should rely on or throw away, right? Sometimes you've got to massively reconfigure your whole system to make it fit a different outcome.
Yeah, yeah, and I mean, just does this also help with some of these, you know, these old objections to coherentism? And so, it's a while since I lectured coherentism, but I remember this slide where we had it was called the coherentist's nightmare. It was this doodle of this person who was, you know, filling in this huge jigsaw, and it's all perfect, but they've got one piece left that doesn't fit, and the you know, the challenge there is to say, well, something seems to have gone wrong overall, you know, because there's this one piece that doesn't fit. But you know, in a way, it's highly coherent. You know, it's a huge jigsaw we've been sort of putting together for a very long time. You know, and it's sort of the idea that, oh, you know, you've got to break that down, you know, and start again because something didn't fit. You might want to say, well, actually, for many purposes, that was fine. It's just for like this one specific purpose, it doesn't work.
Yeah, that seems right to me. I mean, like, you know, have you got a good image on your puzzle? Like, is giving you a picture that like tells you something useful information? Well, it seems like they keep it, right? Maybe down the line you get enough like weird pieces that don't fit anywhere, and like the image is no longer doing quite what you want it to do, and you're like, okay, now it feels like I need to like start breaking down pieces of the puzzle that I'm maybe a little bit more skeptical that these pieces actually fit together the way I thought they were, and like, I think you don't like very rarely do you do the big thing where like, you know, paradigm shift, like throw the whole puzzle up in the air, break it all down, and restart from scratch. Like more often than not, you're taking little pieces and like trying to figure out how they might have gone slightly wrong, and then refit them back into your puzzle as you go to make a better image.
Yeah, I mean, that does make me think we should talk about Kuhn a bit and the paradigm example. So, I mean, you, Kuhn would probably say, you know, this talk of tangles fits in great with the, you know, the normal science paradigm way of thinking about science, where you've built everything up to fit nicely together. You know, your concepts, your methods, your propositions and theories, or whatever you want to include in your paradigm, and it's reliable for, you know, the vast majority of things you're interested in, and normal science just, you know, means accepting it and using it, right? Because it's reliable, you can use it for all sorts of things. But then occasionally, you know, maybe we come across some domain where it's just not working out, and ultimately there's the critical mass of anomalies, and we have to sort of rethink everything. I mean, I can see sort of connections here, but maybe there's differences as well. I mean, I'm sure there are, but yeah, I'm just curious to hear what you think about that, because obviously, you know, you don't want to sort of say, well, this is kind of like the paradigm idea in different language. I mean, that I don't think that's fair, but yeah, do you want to comment on this?
Yeah, I mean, so I don't think this quite fits with like Kuhnian paradigm shift model necessarily. I think there's something about it. You're right. There's like parallel, right? There's sort of this idea of like now you start getting lots of pieces that don't fit, and now we're start really like thinking about the way these like networks are fitting together. And like I've got a bunch of conflicting pieces. Like, what do I do? One way of answering that is to go full paradigm shift. Like you just rip your entire network apart, you start up again. But I think that's missing out on some of the nuances of what the tangle actually is. Like the tangle isn't just theory, right? The tangle is also your practices, your models, your experiments, your empirical data, your data sets, your now like it's all these other pieces that like you don't really like tear those apart and like reset them. Like all those pieces still connect together in pretty much exactly the same way, right? Like why do I take this data from this data set, from this experiment? Like those connections are still going to be in existence. It's still going to be good, right? So maybe the way I think about it's like Kuhn is like a limiting factor on some of the Tangle stuff, where like at the theory level and these sorts of things, like maybe you need to tear apart and like take entire chunks and rearrange them in some way, shape, or form. But like you're still preserving huge aspects of the Tangle and the connections, the ways that work. And the reason you can do that is because they connect together in the right kinds of ways, because they're rich and dense. And that'll also constrain the way that you rearrange them, right? Because they're still going to connect in those kinds of ways to each other.
Yeah, sure. I think as well, sometimes we get these revolutions because we find that there's a major conflict between two different domains, whereas often in contemporary science, like the sort of different fields are deeply entangled. There's work in biology that relates to the periodic table, which relates to the underlying physics, and like if you try and change one thing in that tangle, it's going to affect like so many other things. It's sort of also intimately related. It seems hard to it's hard to imagine in some cases a paradigm shift. Like the periodic table itself, let's say, that's so deeply entangled with all sorts of, not only with itself, all different sort of things that in chemistry, but all sorts of physics, all sorts of biology, and even geology as well, other fields. So yeah, I mean, maybe that would be a case where we wouldn't expect any kind of paradigm shift anytime soon. I mean, what do you think about that? Is that fair?
That seems right to me. I mean, it's not so that I think you couldn't have some sort of horrible, like scary paradigm shift. We just rewrote the entirety of like the periodic table, but like it's so networked into everything else right now, and it works so well in every other place. It'd be really surprising to hit that point, I think. Like even the paradigm shift, like see, like quantum mechanics, general relativity, right? Like we're probably going to head for a new paradigm of some sort at some point with those. But even that's going to preserve a lot of the stuff that's in general relativity and quantum mechanics. I mean, this is all old hash of like philosophy of science, right? Like Newtonian mechanics is the limiting factor of relativity, right? Like these things don't go away; they just get reworked into your original system in some way, shape, or form. And Newtonian mechanics is really well networked into a bunch of stuff, right? It's really good at what it does for the jobs it's put to, right? Again, the context is important for these things.
Yeah. Sure.
Yeah, and so I guess to push back a little closer to some of the pseudoscience stuff, just sort of like as we start to wrap up things, I think one of the interesting things about talking about this in terms of these networks, these like coherent tangles and so forth, and these like, rich, dense, and long-tailed things, and what pseudoscience is that like, I think a lot of bad science and pseudoscience in many ways mimics those structures, right? So one of the things that like, I think we have this idea and when we talk about pseudoscience or bad science, flat earthers and climate denialists and vaccine skeptics and all those sorts of things, they do that they're like stupid in some way, shape, or form. They're like just really radically misunderstanding the way science works. I can't believe they were taken in by this, like, et cetera, et cetera. But I think it's worth recognizing that a lot of these like bad science, pseudoscience things like actually do have structures that very strongly mimic the kind of networks we see in good science, right? And so like when we talk about, flat earth or like say climate skepticism or climate denial, right? Like there are a bunch of studies they're pulling from that are, supposedly supporting their position, and they connect to each other in interesting ways. And like, these people either maliciously or accidentally are building up like networks of evidence that connect together and connect to the final conclusion, right? And so when the general public like looks, I don't know what you think about this, but I think that when the general public looks at these sorts of things, they're actually recognizing something that looks scientific. And that's one of the reasons these things can sometimes be so successful, is because the public is semi-scientifically literate. Like you've done science, you know what to look for. You rarely do people like get heavily engrossed in theories that have like one piece of evidence and nothing else behind them. They're building like connections, right? And so in these spaces where like often pseudoscience can look really good to the lay public, again, either maliciously or just accidentally because of the way they're built up.
Yeah, I feel like this is one of the big challenges with and how useful this could be. I mean, there's one thing is to have a theory of science, and it might be right, but there's another question is, can this theory actually be useful? I mean, I have this, with all of my work, but you kind of want both ideally, but it could be the case that it's for the non-expert, it's often practically impossible to distinguish, a virtuous tangle from a tangle which just has, the feeling of virtuosity. And the reason that might be is just because actually there's, this sort of pseudoscience tangle over here actually looks pretty tangled. It looks pretty rich. I mean, unless you're going to devote hours and hours to studying, but I mean, I'm just talking about somebody who maybe looks at it for a relatively short amount of time, as most people would, I guess, compared with, over here we've got the really rich tangle, and that's just like incredibly complicated. There's loads of things over many years that are pieces that of a puzzle that have been put together. I mean, do you think there's just cases where, as I worry, people wouldn't be able to tell the difference?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are definitely cases where people couldn't tell the difference. I mean, look at science, right? Like, there's plenty of times when we've all thought that, like, this is it, this is science, this works, and then, like, a couple of years later, it turns out that was not good theory. It was missing a bunch of stuff that we thought was, like, we thought it was virtuous. It turns out actually there were a bunch of holes in our reasoning. Think about basically the entire progress of science is us being like, whoop, turns out that thing was not great. Now we need to, like, get a new thing going that is more virtuous. Again, like, it's all a spectrum, right? And so I think it's quite hard for people sometimes to tell these difference. Even trained scientists struggle with this, and a lot of it's done within the context of the best work we've got. But yeah, I think there are definitely cases where, like, people who are not thinking in terms of these structures and this language are going to struggle to tell the difference between them. And that's, I think, all the more reason to bring this sort of language more into the public conversation about these things. Because if we're just saying, look, it's bad science because, like, here was this problem with this study, like, if it's part of a broad net, like, science always has problems with studies, right? There's always issues. Newton, like, recognized there were conflicts with his own theory, even at the time he was, like, doing it, right? And so I think if we start to think a little more and talk a little more in terms of, like, okay, look, but, like, is the network dense? Like, do you have enough evidence here, or is it just, like, a bunch of, like, very sexy results that, like, are very sparsely populated, but, like, connect together in this, like, seemingly very attractive ways, right? Like, or is it long tail? Like, are you really pulling evidence from elsewhere? Like, are you doing that consistently, or is it just, like, in, like, as with astrology, like, one particular area you're pulling from really heavily, and then, like, nothing else you're doing connects outwards in any way, shape, or form? And so if we can start to talk, I think, about better and worse structures as ways to start identifying these things, and if we have that language available to people as they think through these things, it'll help us distinguish them. But, like, again, I don't think I want to blame people for making mistakes in this, because we make mistakes with this all the time in science.
Yeah, another good example is the big tobacco stories about the link between smoking and cancer, and I think they worked really hard to sort of piece things together so it looked like a really rich tangle or structure, but clearly, as we know, quite maliciously, really. But one way, a concept worth bringing in here is confirmation bias as well. I mean, this can be unintentional as well. I mean, in the case of big tobacco, it can be intentional, maybe. They're just going to intentionally draw on anything that seems to fit together to build a stronger structure that serves their purposes. But also, you can have people who just unintentionally tend to sort of ignore things that are more serious threats to their way of thinking, and tend to be more open to accepting things, or less critically analyze the things that don't fit so well, and that do fit well, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, I really like that, actually, as a way of thinking about, like, people build their own networks and, like, and their own tangles, and, like, what you include in your tangle is just as important as, like, what the internal structure of it. Like, you have to make good choices about what evidence you're bringing in, and that's, again, hard for people to do, especially when they've got biases. And, again, scientists do this all the time. We think very carefully about, like, what do we allow in as evidence and what don't we allow as evidence? What methodologies we think are working and what don't? Like, what experiments should we think are doing the right kinds of things and which ones we want to discard? Even outliers, right? So, like, we think very carefully about what we allow in, and, like, if you've got someone who's building a tangle with that, like, is disregarding a bunch of really important information that would conflict, that means that I mean, But again, this ties into the like more sparse tangles. It's not going to have as much evidence in it, right? Like all these little bits, it's not going to be as rich, you're not going to have as much like diversity of the pieces if you're discarding huge chunks of things because they conflict you. But again, it's all like a spectrum. Like you might well have things that are actually very virtuous tangles that it turns out down the line was not great. Or like maybe even now we might recognize as a pseudoscience and be like, actually, it's like looks pretty good. And so there isn't going to be a clean divide or a clean answer to these questions. It's all going to have to be like judgment based as we go. And like there are rules of thumb. I think things like the tangle give us the help with, but like, yeah, as with all things in science, it's just a messy practice.
Sure. Okay, well, we got I guess, are we moving on to Q&A? I guess we just got 15 minutes left. So is that right, Anthony?
Yeah, thank you. Q&A it is. Thanks for the conversation, and let's just get cracking straight in. There's quite a few questions come in, some more general, some more specific. I'll start with a fairly general one, which is from Alice, who says, the focus of Anne's tangle theory seems to be primarily on the natural sciences. I'm interested in finding out more about the social and political implications of her theory. What can it say to something like the rise of racial pseudoscience or the ways that science can be used to justify patriarchal structures, etc.? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great question. And one so that I want to think about more going forward. So I think it's actually something that the structures that we put forward in the book can be helpful in thinking about. Again, in the book, we focus very heavily on like physics theories and biology, because like that's where our experts is. But we also talk a little bit about, RCT stuff and medicine. I write some stuff on political theory and some of the stuff happening in there. And so like, I think there are applications. Certainly I want to say that like these other areas are just as tangled and networked. As a matter of fact, I think in many ways, to get back to like, Peter bringing up coherence theory, right? Like it's about the coherence of our beliefs and our knowledges. And so I think the language that we use in the book, this sort of like long-tailed, rich, entangled stuff can help us analyze why something's going wrong in these other cases as well. Certainly when I work with a lot of social scientists and groups that think about like environmental justice, and I think all the stuff we talk about in the book can really heavily be applied in those spaces as well. And it's something that I'm really keen to sort of think about going forward as we bring these things out of sort of the hard science spaces and use this stuff to help distinguish stuff in other areas.
Thank you, Peter. Is there anything you want to pick up on in Anne's response to the question or the original question itself from Alice?
No, I don't think so, except I don't see a serious problem with this idea crossing over to social sciences and other areas. I think this kind of language helps. Let me just say this because some of the older theories of pseudoscience that had to do with a specific scientific methodology maybe wouldn't cross over so well because, as we now know and now widely accepted, scientific methodology differs significantly in many different fields. So the kind of old Popperian idea of tying pseudoscience to a specific scientific methodology, I don't think that would cross over as well as the tangle of science idea.
Thank you. So I'll ask one of the more specific questions, which obviously the answer may be, I don't know that much about it, so we'll have to pass. But this is from Aves, who asks, do you have any thoughts on the recent controversy in the neuroscientific community around integrated information theory of consciousness and whether it should be considered pseudoscience? So I don't know if you know anything about that.
I have read something on this actually relatively recently. Do I remember the exact details? No, absolutely not. But like there is like I think a very like coherent debate about exactly these questions happening in that space. I think I need to read more about the actual theory underpinning it. I don't know, Peter, have you read anything about this?
Not much, but I have a thought that this is exploratory, right? And I mean, you might say it's controversial, but a lot of exploratory sciences are controversial, at least initially. And I don't know if you agree with this, Ansi, but a new or exploratory idea can't I guess, be deeply entangled with the rest of science initially, because it's just being worked on. So a lot of if it could eventually become entangled with lots of other different scientific ideas or scientific fields, but initially it can't be, because we're just exploring it. So in that case, it couldn't be criticized for not being entangled with the rest of science, right? Because
Yeah, yes and no. Because I think what you can criticize is how well it's entangled as a theory, right? So as like the thing that we're trying to support, you can talk about how well it's connected to everything else that's happening in the field, right? And so like if it's only drawing, like, if my new theory only draws on like these particular models and none of the other evidence happening in the field, like I should be really worried about that, right? Whereas if it's something that like actually connects really strongly, like why should I think that this thing works? Well, because like this thing here supports this thing, and this thing was super useful in other places, and like it seems in parallel. That's like you can start to talk about how it's maybe how it is branching outwards upwards, but like the stuff below it, right? Like, is that coherent? Is it well supported? Is it like the kind of thing where like, yeah, it seems like I can take this thing and lift it and put it over here and it supports this thing. And so I think you can start to have those conversations relatively early on and start to identify better and worse theory. Now, again, obviously a lot of theory, like things that look really good to start off with, may fall off in the like long term, because some of the pieces underneath it turns out either weren't doing what we thought they were, or like weren't as strong as we thought they were, or like actually there was a better explanation that all these things also supported over this direction that was better tangled, right? So it's going to be variable. But like, I think you can start to analyze these things right from the beginning, even if we can't then talk about how useful they've been to other tangles.
You could have a slightly different view on what's pursuit worthy in science, I guess, and it may be that these ideas are pursuit worthy for some of the reasons you just mentioned. You can already at the beginning see their links to the theoretical links over here and over here. But maybe you don't know if it's reliable yet, because it's new. It's a new subfield or something. But yeah,
gets it back into like all the falsifications and stuff. Where just because like you can say I think this is going to be reliable, but like whether it's actually reliable or not depends on you actually trying to use it in these contexts. And the better off your tangle is, the more likely it is you're going to succeed in that context. But you're not really certain until you've actually tried it, right? Until you've launched the rocket, are you certain that like, yeah, all those things work together in the right kind of way, even though you can be pretty confident going in that it's going to happen.
Thank you. So picking up on the thing about consciousness, Trevor comments usefully in the chat that the main issue is numerous scientists inaccurately classifying this theory of consciousness as pseudoscience. I thought that linked quite nicely to Ian's question, which is there any identifiable difference between science and pseudoscience beyond the breadth of acceptance within the scientific community? So I thought Trevor's comment was quite interesting about when a scientist's warranted or justified in calling pseudoscience, and then Ian's question relates to this sort of demarcation thing.
Yeah. Did you want to add something, Peter?
I was just going to say that we want to be really careful about sort of, for silencing some line of research, if you like, some saying that's pseudoscience, so you shouldn't be doing it. I mean, I think there's a difference between genuine pseudoscience, which, if you like, the paradigm example would be somebody who's got some theory which clearly isn't science, but they're trying to dress it up as science in order to sort of make it more appealing or give it more weight. And some scientists who are exploring a radical idea that they think might have some promise. I mean, calling that pseudoscience, I think, is more dangerous, because actually you might want a small number of scientists in your field to pursue a radical idea that most people think won't go anywhere.
Yeah, I mean, I think it gets back down to like the temporal aspect of pseudoscience, right? Things that were good science become pseudoscience, things that were pseudoscience become science, right? And it's really hard to predict what exactly is going to shift between them. Now, that's not to say we can't be better and worse at predicting them, right? So like, when Newton did his theory of gravity, right, like he had a bunch of evidence on the pieces he was looking at. He was like, actually, I think this thing explains a bunch of stuff and connects in really good ways, in ways that, like, at the time, again, like people were super reluctant to take this up for at least a little while. And so you get the shift from like, well, is it good science? Like, oh, actually, I can probably watch this one because this one looks like it's doing something that looks good, in ways that, like, you know, again, flat Earth stuff in the modern day, right? Like, do we want scientists to be exploring whether or not the Earth is flat? Probably not. Why? Well, because there's so much overwhelming evidence against it that, like, you're allowed to be like, there's no real merit to this as an area of study. But when you get these like interesting in-between ones where you're like, look, like 90% of us think it's probably not going to go anywhere, but like, we can't guarantee that. You know, there's not enough evidence one way or another at this point, or like it's not really doing what we're just not sure. Sometimes it's worth having people doing these sorts of things. The thing that springs to mind is, you know, work in cold fusion, which, like, you know, it's been on and off again a science and a pseudoscience for decades now, and like there are still people working on cold fusion stuff, and like, great, like I think people should be working on these kinds of things. Whether or not it's going to pan out, like, God knows, but like I certainly don't want to say like this is like bad science per se, and we should never pursue it. I also want to, like, you know, scientists are better judges at these things. We're not perfect judges at these things, right? Like, we're all just doing things based on our intuitions and our understanding and like expert judgments in these things, but like we're still making judgment calls, which means that scientists aren't going to be perfect either. And just because a lot of scientists say something is pseudoscience doesn't necessarily mean that we need to immediately dismiss it.
Thank you. So we're pretty much at time. Alexandria asked if Ansi could summarize your book in 2 sentences. So that seems quite a good way to close out the conversation.
2 sentences, good grief. Probably something like, most scientists don't act as if science is true, they act as if it's reliable. And reliability hinges on the kinds of evidence networks we're building into something, which are highly context-based. And that's part of what science is figuring out what those contexts are and building the right kind of network / tangle to support the work you're doing. And those can be better or worse.